with whom he entered into business relations. He couldn't even trust himself, if he were honest. And without that trust, what would happen? Boyd Smith's employer, went to work in a lithography shop at the age of 14. He worked there 7 years. He showed a talent as a painter. His employer paid for him to go to Paris and study for 2 years. This was actually very common in the mid-19th century, that employers felt a sense of personal responsibility, personal connection, and the community expected them to help their employees who showed talent. By the beginning of the 20th century, that kind of personal connection was beginning to disappear, and it's part of feeling that there's a more deep moral decline underway, aside from all the obvious dishonesty. People, if there's moral decline, how could people count on each other for support? If that collapsed, each person was lost in the jungle of the market at a disadvantage in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by very wealthy tycoons. So this is part of what Rebecca Edwards is talking about when she talks about the wedge, the term that she borrows from Henry George's Progress and Poverty, and begins to develop. It's not simply a sense of economic instability, it's a sense of moral disorder attacking everyone. The solution for many farmers, these are early advertisements for farm machinery, which is about the only place where you'll see pictures of women in these photographs of farm life. So the solution for many farmers, well, I'll go back to here, was organization, both political and economic. Now, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the historian told a story of agrarian populists who were small farmers motivated by an ideal of self-sufficiency and organizing themselves to protect a pre-capitalist way of life. More recent research shows that the farmers who led the populist movement and who were engaged in it in a very active way were fully committed to modern market-based agriculture, were fully committed to using technology and scientific expertise. They did not see the corporation as a particularly effective way of organizing agricultural production, and cooperatives seemed to them to be a better way, one that respected the diversity of land ownership based on individual commitment to invest and improve that had become the signature feature of the U.S. economy. Farmers, the populist movement was saying that individual farmers are more likely to invest in the land and improve it than corporations were. But cooperatives were themselves a way of organizing collective energy to realize a potential for significantly increased volume of production, distribution, and consumption. American agriculture was extraordinarily successful. By the end of the 19th century, slightly over 50% of all food sold in the entire world had been produced in the United States. Now, this isn't the same thing as food grown or food eaten, but food sold. 52-point-something% of food sold was grown in the United States. If you think about one country being able to dominate the global agricultural markets, it's really an amazing story of organization, a lot of which will have to do with the development of the corporation form. Populists, the agrarian, the small farmers existed within an older religious and metaphysical framework, so they framed their concerns in terms that were highly charged by concepts of morality and mutual responsibilities. So if you were one out of three Iowa farmers who lost their property in the second half of the 1880s, to view the activities of bankers, railroad owners, and property speculators as immoral made all the difference in how you viewed your own failure. It meant it was no longer something purely personal that you had failed. Even though it's fair to assume that in many cases, failure was the result of bad choices people made or sudden impulses like the depressed Milton Leeper to abandon a piece of land that would only have bad memories for him because of the death of his wife and child. As soon as you said it wasn't just a question of hard luck or poor choice, it was easier then to say that the government should do something about protecting farmers for the common good. Agricultural politics and economics were particularly fraught because of the ideological significance of agriculture and because of the desire of so many Americans to find security and independence through owning a farm. And because economic changes were transforming agricultural practices and markets and making a potential for making a profit like no farmer had been able to make previously, at least in the United States, in the northern part of the United States. The notion that the farmer and farm life were the essence of American life persisted as the U.S. industrialized. So with the paintings that I showed you, the idyllic scenes, but between 1865 and 1900, the number of farms doubled, although the average acreage declined. Machinery was introduced and there was more intensive production. So in 1860, farmers were 60% of the workforce. By 1900, they were 37%, and their contribution to national wealth declined from 1/3 to 1/4, but they were still making lots of money for somebody. The growing efficiency of farms meant that fewer people could make respectable livings from farm activity, but that farming became an even more attractive as a way of life. But it was a highly vulnerable way of life, and the costs of machinery and debt service were always high. To be a farmer on the scale of Lux Miller required the ability to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. And there was still, and then you had to be able to outlast pests and other natural disasters. And what would you do if train or riverboat operators suddenly raised their rates? Where are we? So I think as it's 5:30 or 5:29, we'll call it quits for today, and on Monday we'll wrap up the story about agriculture and move on to the Industrial Revolution and the development of corporations.